In a world where legacy and wealth rule, David Kamanzi, a billionaire with everything but one thing, an heir, faces a shocking truth. He is sterile. Desperate to secure his family's future, he strikes an unusual deal with Lydia, a homeless woman carrying a child, offering her shelter in exchange for what he wants most. But as their lives become intertwined, both are forced to confront their deepest fears, and an unexpected bond begins to form. One that challenges everything they thought they knew about family, love, and sacrifice. Will this unconventional deal lead to salvation, or will it destroy them both? If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. David Kamanzi sat quietly in the sterile hospital room, his eyes fixed on the doctor. The walls were white, the air was cold, and the silence between them felt thick, suffocating. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks, trying to push away the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But now, as the doctor's words echoed in the quiet room, he realized just how wrong he had been. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kamanzi," the doctor said, his voice hesitant, "but the tests are conclusive. You are sterile." David remained still, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of what he had just heard. The weight of the words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His chest tightened, and for a moment, it felt as though he couldn't breathe. He had built his entire life around the idea of family, of carrying on the Kamanzi name, of continuing the legacy his father had built. Without children, without heirs, what would become of everything he had worked for? The doctor's voice broke through his thoughts. "We've run the test 3 times, Mr. Kamanzi. There's zero motility. The chances of you ever conceiving naturally are non-existent." David's hands clenched at his sides, the words cutting deeper than any physical pain he had ever felt. His father, a towering figure in the world of business, had lived until the day he died, never missing a beat, never once worried about his legacy. David had always assumed that he would follow the same path. But now, as the reality of his condition settled in, the future he had imagined for himself, the future of his family, seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. "Run it again," David demanded sharply, his voice cold and controlled, but inside his heart raced. "This can't be right. My father, he was healthy until the day he passed. How can this be happening to me?" The doctor glanced at him with sympathy in his eyes, but David was too lost in his own thoughts to see it. The man in front of him was just a doctor, a professional delivering bad news. But David needed answers. He needed a way out. The thought of never becoming a father, of never having the children who would carry on his name, gnawed at him. His empire, his legacy, what good were they if they had no one to inherit them? "We've done everything we can, Mr. Kamanzi," the doctor replied softly, his voice a whisper now. "The results are final. I'm afraid this is something you'll have to come to terms with." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He didn't know what else to say. There was nothing left to say. His world had just been turned upside down. His legacy, his future, everything he had worked for, seemed meaningless without children to pass it on to. As he walked out of the room, he barely registered the sounds around him. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts of what he could do. He needed a solution, needed something to make this all right. His father had left him everything: wealth, power, a name. But none of that mattered now. What was the point of all of it if he could never have children of his own? Outside the hospital, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the busy streets of Kigali. David's driver, Kunle, was waiting in the black SUV, his hands resting casually on the wheel as he glanced up at his boss. "Sir, should I take you home?" Kunle asked, his voice a neutral question, but David could hear the concern in his tone. David's eyes were fixed on the streets ahead, the rows of cars moving slowly in the evening traffic. His heart was heavy, his mind still reeling from the doctor's words. "No," David replied, his voice distant. "Drive around. I need air." Kunle hesitated, but he nodded and began driving, taking a route through the less prosperous parts of the city. The streets here were different. Rusted shanties lined the roads, street vendors shouted their wares, and the hustle of the city felt raw and real. David felt detached from it all, as if he was watching from a distance, unable to connect with the world around him. Then, on a street corner, under the Oenda Bridge, David saw her. A young woman, barefoot and tired, sat on a piece of flattened cardboard. Her skin was pale, her face gaunt with exhaustion, and she clutched a torn bag tightly in her hands. But it was her eyes that caught David's attention. There was something about her, something that made him stop and stare. For a moment, their eyes locked, and David felt a jolt, a strange connection. The woman's sign, written in bold letters, read, "Pregnant and homeless, please help." David's heart twisted. The world he had been living in, his pristine office, his empire, seemed so far removed from this moment, from this woman. He had everything, and yet he felt empty. This woman had nothing, but her eyes held a strength that he couldn't quite understand. "Stop the car," David said abruptly, his voice breaking through the silence. Kunle turned to look at him, his face showing surprise. "Sir?" David's voice was firm. "I said stop the car." The SUV came to a halt, and David stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. The woman looked up, confusion and fear in her eyes. David reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill, and walked over to her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. She whispered, "Lydia." David nodded, taking in the sight of her. He glanced at her swollen belly. "How far along are you?" he asked. 7 months, Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. David took a breath, feeling a rush of desperation. This was crazy. This was reckless. But then again, desperation was a breeding ground for madness, and his legacy, his family's name, had always meant everything. To him, "I'll help you," David said, his voice soft but firm. "Come with me. I'll give you food, shelter, and a deal that could change your life forever." Lydia looked at him, unsure. "Why me?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. David's eyes were steady as he replied, "Because you're carrying something more valuable than you know." As Lydia hesitated, David extended his hand, and for the first time in a long while, his future seemed uncertain. But there was something about this moment, something that felt right, something that made him believe that perhaps this was the answer he had been searching for. And so, the story began. Lydia hesitated, her tired eyes scanning David's outstretched hand. She had lived on the streets for so long that every part of her screamed to run, to stay away from anything that might seem too good to be true. People who offered help always wanted something in return, didn't they? But David's eyes, though distant and calculating, didn't look like the eyes of someone who wanted to take advantage. For a moment she felt as though he truly wanted to help her, not just because of her pregnancy, but because he saw something in her that others often overlooked. Lydia stood, her legs trembling from the strain of being on her feet all day. Her swollen belly ached with each movement, but she forced herself to push through. The streets had taught her one thing: if you didn't keep moving, you would be left behind. Slowly she reached out and took David's hand, unsure of what would come next, but too exhausted to question it further. David led her to the back seat of the black SUV. The cool air conditioning greeted her as she sank into the plush seat, an unusual comfort that felt out of place. She glanced around the interior of the car, the soft leather seats, the tinted windows, the smooth hum of the engine. It felt like a world she didn't belong to. Her worn clothes, her dusty hands, everything about her screamed that she was from another life, one where wealth and privilege were distant concepts. David slid into the seat beside her, his gaze fixed on his phone as the vehicle began to move. His silence only heightened Lydia's unease. She had no idea what he wanted from her, but the nagging feeling in her gut told her it wasn't going to be simple. "Where are you taking me?" Lydia asked, trying to break the silence, her voice thick with uncertainty. "To my house," David replied, his voice calm and distant. "It's not far." Lydia glanced at him, feeling the weight of his words. My house. A house. Something that had always been a foreign concept to her, something she had never had the luxury of imagining. She had spent so many nights in alleyways, on cold concrete, with only a piece of cardboard for comfort. She had begged for change, done menial work just to survive another day. But a house, a real home, was beyond her. Minutes later, the SUV turned into a private gated estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by tall gates, well-manicured lawns, and a fountain that sparkled in the fading sunlight. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. This was nothing like the life she had known. This was a life she never even dared to dream of. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the mansion, and David opened the door for her, his voice breaking through her stunned silence. "Come inside." Lydia took a deep breath as she stepped out of the car. The marble pillars, the grandiose design of the house, everything about it made her feel small, out of place. She had never seen anything like this before. It was beautiful, but it also felt like a dream, something unattainable, something that could disappear the moment she reached for it. Inside, the staff froze as they saw David with Lydia, a woman who appeared so out of place in such a luxurious setting. Lydia felt their gazes, the curiosity and judgment in their eyes, but David remained unaffected, his focus on her. "Prepare her a room," he instructed one of the staff members, "and get her food, lots of it." His voice was firm, but there was something softer underneath it, a hint of concern that Lydia didn't know how to interpret. As she was escorted upstairs, Lydia's mind was racing. She couldn't help but wonder why David had chosen her. She wasn't special. She wasn't even someone he knew. She was just a pregnant homeless woman who had nowhere to go. Why had he taken her in? Upstairs, the guest room was nothing like she had expected. The bed was large, with soft, luxurious sheets. There was a vanity with fresh flowers, a large window that let in the fading light of the evening. Everything in this room screamed wealth, and Lydia felt completely out of place. The maid left her alone in the room, and Lydia sat down on the bed, her hands resting on her belly. She had come so far from the streets, and now for the first time in months she had a roof over her head. But she felt no joy. Instead, she felt a strange sense of confusion. What was this all for? What was David really offering her? Soon, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A staff member entered with a tray of food, placing it gently on the bed in front of her. Eggs, fruit, yam, and a drink she couldn't quite name. Her stomach growled loudly at the sight, but she hesitated. The food was overwhelming. She had never had this much at one time, not in her wildest dreams. "Go ahead," the maid encouraged her. "It's all for you." Lydia's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the fork. She had learned to eat quickly, never knowing when her next meal would come, but this was different. This was too much. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the food, unsure of what to do next. Then, David appeared at the door. He leaned against the frame, his eyes softening as he saw her. "You eat like someone who's never had breakfast before," he said with a small, amused smile. Lydia's eyes flickered up to meet his, her embarrassment clear. "I haven't," she murmured. Her voice felt small, like she didn't belong in this world, in this moment. David walked in and sat down opposite her, his eyes watching her carefully. For a moment, there was only silence between them. He had helped her, taken her off the streets, but there was still so much Lydia didn't understand. Why had he done it? What did he expect from her? "I know this must feel strange," David said finally, breaking the silence. "But this is real. You don't have to worry about anything here. You'll be safe." Lydia met his gaze, her emotions swirling. She didn't know what to say, how to respond. She was too confused, too overwhelmed to process everything. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this grand house. Hope. Maybe it was fleeting, maybe it was foolish, but it was there. a small flicker that seemed to grow with every word David spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you, Lydia," he said, his voice softer now. "I just want to help. You don't have to do anything for me. Just be here. You and your baby." Lydia nodded, but inside she still had 1,000 questions. What was David's real intention? What did he want from her? As the night stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing, but she didn't yet understand how. And in that moment, David wasn't just a billionaire offering a deal. He was something more. A man with his own scars, his own loneliness, offering a strange, unspoken kindness. But Lydia couldn't yet see the depth of the change he was offering. She only knew that her life had just taken an unpredictable turn, and she was unsure whether it was a blessing or a curse. Days passed, and Lydia found herself adjusting to a life she never thought possible. The mansion, with its towering walls, polished floors, and gleaming chandeliers, felt like a dream she was unsure she belonged to. Every time she woke up in her grand guest room, she half expected to find herself back on the streets. But every time she touched the soft sheets or heard the gentle hum of the mansion's air conditioning, she was reminded that this was her reality now. A reality that felt strange and unfamiliar, yet comforting in its own way. David, though a mystery to her, had been kind, at least by his standards. He had checked in on her daily, made sure she had everything she needed, and offered little glances of warmth, but still, he kept his distance. He treated her with respect, but there was always an underlying sense of formality. She was still just a woman he had taken in as part of his deal. Nothing more. But as the weeks passed, Lydia began to notice something in David that she hadn't seen before. His icy demeanor had softened just a little, though it was still hidden beneath layers of business suits and detached conversations. There was something in the way he looked at her now, a curiosity, a slight shift in the way he observed her, as though he was no longer seeing her just as a means to an end. One evening, Lydia was sitting by the grand window, gazing out at the lush gardens that stretched far beyond the mansion. She had always felt a sense of wonder when she looked out here. The world outside the mansion felt so distant, so far from the life she had known just months ago. She had once walked the dirty streets of Kigali, begging for scraps, fighting for survival. But now she had a room of her own, food that filled her stomach, and a child growing inside her. But what was the cost? She had agreed to a deal, one that had given her everything, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was just another part of David's calculated plan. She had never thought of herself as anything but a survivor, but in this house she was beginning to wonder if she could be more. It was during one of her nightly walks around the mansion's estate that she encountered David again. This time, he wasn't in his usual business attire, but in a casual shirt and jeans. The change in him was subtle but noticeable. There was no wall of formality between them now. He looked different, more human, less like the cold businessman she had first met. "You're up late," David said, his voice quieter than usual as he approached her. Lydia turned to face him, offering a soft smile, but there was something heavy in her chest. She had been thinking about her situation, about the baby she was carrying, and about the life she had never had. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her gaze drifting to the garden. "It's all so overwhelming." David nodded, his expression unreadable. "I get that," he said. "Everything about this situation is overwhelming. I understand." For a moment, Lydia wasn't sure what to say. She had wanted to ask him so many questions, to dig deeper into the man behind the suit, the billionaire who had offered her everything. But she had always held back, afraid of what she might uncover. "Do you ever feel like—" Lydia started, but she trailed off, unsure of how to continue. David tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Like what?" he prompted. "Like you've given up something to get all of this?" Lydia gestured around them, her hand sweeping across the mansion. "Like maybe in trying to get everything you wanted, you've lost something important." David was quiet for a long moment. He seemed to be processing her words, turning them over in his mind. His gaze softened, but it was quickly masked by a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You ask the right questions," he said, his voice low. "But I've spent my whole life building this empire. I've always believed that if you work hard enough, if you're strategic enough, you can have everything you need. But maybe I've missed the point." Lydia blinked, surprised by the honesty in his words. She had always seen David as someone who had everything figured out, someone who didn't need anyone else. But now, in the quiet of the night, she saw something else in him, a vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. "I used to think I had to do it all alone," David continued. "I thought that legacy, wealth, power, that they were all that mattered. But now I see it's about something else." He paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "It's about the people you bring into your life. It's about love, connection, and trust." Lydia felt her heart beat faster. She had never expected David to say such things, not from the man who had treated her like a transaction just weeks ago. His words were unexpected, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just two strangers, two people with a contract with something to gain. There was more, something that Lydia wasn't ready to fully acknowledge yet. "I've never trusted anyone," David admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "Not really, but you—" He stopped himself, shaking his head as if he had said too much. Lydia's pulse quickened. She knew what he was trying to say, but she couldn't let herself believe it. Not yet. She had come this far by keeping her guard up, by not letting herself get too attached. She couldn't afford to fall into the trap of believing that David's change in behavior meant anything more than a temporary shift. But then, as if sensing her hesitation, David stepped closer. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said softly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. But just know that I want to help you. I want to help you and your child." The sincerity in his words hit Lydia harder than she had expected. She had thought she understood this arrangement, but now she wasn't so sure. Could David's sudden change be genuine? Could this man who had once seen her as a means to an end be someone who truly cared? For the first time in a long while, Lydia allowed herself to hope. Perhaps this wasn't just about her baby, about her survival, but about something much bigger, something that could change both of their lives. But the road ahead was still uncertain. The deal she had made with David still hung over her like a shadow, and she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it wasn't just her future at stake, but his as well. Would their unexpected bond be enough to change everything? Or would the weight of their pasts, his legacy, her survival, tear them apart? As the night drew to a close, Lydia couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anticipation. Something was changing. Something had shifted. But whether it was for better or worse, she couldn't yet tell. The weeks following that conversation felt like a blur for Lydia. There was a subtle shift in the way David treated her, a change in his presence, his words, and his actions. He was no longer the distant, calculating billionaire who had offered her shelter for his own purposes. There was something else now, something more personal. He checked on her often, his eyes softer than before, his voice gentler. He asked how she was feeling, how the baby was growing, and if she needed anything. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. It was about her and the life she was carrying. But even with all this attention, Lydia still couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a part in a story that wasn't truly hers. The mansion, the luxury, the servants who catered to her every need, all of it felt like an illusion, a dream that she couldn't fully wake up from. Every night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her guest room, wondering if she would wake up the next day back on the streets. One afternoon, as Lydia sat in the garden, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, she saw David walking toward her, his face serious. The usual lightness in his step was gone, replaced by a determined stride. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. Something had changed again. "Lydia," David said as he stopped in front of her, his voice low. "I need to talk to you about something important." Lydia felt a knot form in her stomach. The tone of his voice wasn't one she had heard before. This was different, more urgent. She sat up straight, her eyes fixed on him. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. David took a deep breath, his gaze shifting away for a moment before meeting hers. "It's about the baby," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking a lot about this arrangement we've made, about you and the child." Lydia's heart raced. She had always known this moment would come, the moment when the contract would come back into play, when the reality of their situation would hit them both, but she had hoped for just a moment that maybe it wouldn't. "You're carrying my child, Lydia," David continued, his eyes steady, but his voice soft. "I can't just take the child and walk away. This means something. I want to be a father. I want to raise this child. I want to be there for them, but I also want to be there for you." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The words David was saying were not what she had expected. She had imagined him wanting to take the child and leave her behind, as just another pawn in his game of legacy. But this was different. This was real. David knelt down beside her, his hands resting on her knees. "I know this started out as a business deal, Lydia. I know it wasn't supposed to be anything more than that. But something has changed. I've changed. And I don't want to go back to the way things were." Lydia looked at him, her mind spinning. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would determine everything. She had always thought that David saw her as a means to an end, something to fulfill his desire for a family. But now, he was speaking to her as though she was more than just that. He was speaking to her as a partner, as a mother to his child, and maybe, just maybe, as a woman who had a place in his life. "You're not just offering me a chance at a better life for the baby," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're offering me a chance to be a part of something, to be a family. You want me and the baby to have a future, don't you?" David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes," he said softly. "I want you to have everything. I want us to have everything. Together." Lydia felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't just a woman who had been thrown away by the world, who had nothing but a child to cling to. She was someone who mattered. She was someone who could have a family, a future, and that future could be with David. But as the truth of his words sank in, so did the weight of the decision that lay before her. She had agreed to the contract, out of desperation, out of necessity. But now that agreement felt like a distant memory. She wasn't just giving her child to David for wealth and security anymore. She was giving him a piece of her heart, and she had to decide whether she was ready to give him that. "I don't know if I can just walk away from everything we've built here," Lydia said quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can just let you take my baby and not be a part of their life." David's expression softened. He reached out, his hand gently resting on hers. "Lydia, this isn't just about a contract anymore. It's about us. It's about our family. And if you'll have me, I want to raise this child with you. I don't want to be just a man with a legacy. I want to be a father. And I want to be with you by your side every step of the way." Lydia looked down at her belly, the child she was carrying. She had carried this life inside her for months now. And in those months, she had come to realize something she hadn't expected. She had come to love this child, to feel the connection between them, to know that she wasn't just carrying a baby for someone else's legacy. She was carrying the future of a family, her family. She looked back up at David, her heart racing. "I never thought I would say this, but I want that too," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I want to raise this child with you. I want us to be a family." David's face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire world around them. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice filled with relief and joy. "Let's build this family together. No more contracts, no more deals. Just us and the future we're going to create." For the first time, Lydia felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't just a woman with a past anymore. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was a woman with a family, with a future, and with a man who wanted to walk beside her not because of a deal, but because he cared. As David took her hand, leading her back inside the mansion, Lydia knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful, something real, something that had started with uncertainty but would end with love. She wasn't just carrying a baby, she was carrying the future, and she wasn't alone anymore.